Welcome to today's podcast. I'm Granny Rhea.
And I'm Auntie Donia.
And we're here to talk about super special kids and cake.
Yes, cake!
We're coming to you from the studios of Sacred Heart University in Fairfield, Connecticut. This podcast is brought to you by our book, Let's Talk, Social Communicative Services and Supports for Your Young Child with ASD, published by Paul H. Brooks and available from Amazon.
Our super special topic of today is adolescents with special needs. And we're joined by our super special guest, Christi Kaplain. Christi is also a speech-language pathologist, a consultant at NYU for the ASD Nest program, and she has an adult brother with ASD. Welcome, Christi, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Christi, you have a brother with autism who's now in his 30s and he's happily married.
He is. He's living independently. He has a job. Took a while to find the right job for him, but he has a full-time job. He takes a lot of pride in his work. In fact, though he is eligible for Social Security, he chooses not to because it would limit the amount of time he could work. And he really gets, I don't think it's his ultimate dream job, but he gets a lot of fulfillment out of feeling productive and useful and getting a paycheck, most importantly.
Right.
And he's married.
So, tell us about his relationship and how he met his wife and what their marriage is like.
Well, a lot of people listening will relate to how anxiety-provoking it is to watch someone you love with ASD in the dating process. And when he started dating, there was a lot of online dating going on. So that he was doing that, meeting people online, and with a little guidance from his parents, my parents, he was finding safe places to meet the women. And there were some that were not so good, but in the end, he found someone who was just the right fit for him. And it's, quirky, and they find things adorable and rewarding about each other that, perhaps wouldn't be a match for someone else, but it is a match for them. It's not to say that's without challenges, especially in communication and miscommunications. So there are times that family members help out, step in to try to help when they're in a big fight over a miscommunication or someone's feelings are hurt, and my brother will have a big reaction, bigger than typical, and perhaps not reacting in the most adult-like, but learns from that. And with some guidance from my mother, from myself, my other sisters, I think every time is a growth opportunity, and they're happy. They're very happy, and they have an apartment together, and they have a pool, and they swim together.
Does she have a job as well?
Excellent question. She does, and she does not have a diagnosis, but she recently got a new job. That was a really big deal, and she works. I'm not sure actually how many hours, probably part to full time, but they're both busy, and she's very good with her friend groups and socializing. So that, you can imagine, is a nice balance, and probably pulls him out to do things more than he normally would, because he gets a lot of, he's happy to be with her, and he has a handful of friends he likes to be with, but is also happy to be home. Social media, games, swimming, other things that aren't necessarily with a close group of friends. So I think that's a nice balance for them, because she's very social.
Were there challenges apart from relationships that you were aware of as your brother was growing up?
Were there challenges? Yes. Where to begin? Yes, definitely. my brother is adopted. You may not know this, Donia does. So he came to live with us when he was a few months old. And, I think everybody sort of knew right from the start that something was a little bit different, but he didn't have a diagnosis. So, developmentally, things were off course, so he was less happy to be held. There were sensory issues that came up a lot. And, as he got into adolescence, middle school, as the hormones sort of kicked in, then the behaviors changed too. And, there were times he had to be picked up from school for throwing a chair, or just having one of those big reactions and not knowing what to do with it, and being misunderstood. So that was a challenge for a while. And, there's a lot of, yes, there were lots. I don't know where to start and begin, start and end.
I know your mum has been really influential in terms of how she's supported him over the years. And one of the things that really stood out to me is how she really accepted his behaviours. And just, there was a story you shared with me about the flags. That when...
Yeah. Yes, there are lots of stories. So this, I was probably about 11, 12. And he's gone through different interest phases. And this was when he was really into flags. Flags were everywhere, all over our front yard. Anytime he'd be in a car, there'd be a flag out the window. We'd go to the beach, and everybody knew where we were because we had flags surrounding the entire area. And my older sister and I would sort of sneak off with a blanket and say, that's not our family over there, because we were getting to that age. But, my parents never said, no, you can't do that. I mean, obviously there were limits, I'm sure, that if it was unsafe, but that's what he loved, and that made going to the beach fun for him, setting up his flags. And, they didn't care that there were flags all over the front yard because he was doing something that he felt was productive, and he was engaged, and I don't know. So, yes, so maybe perhaps that was one of the stories. Some of the phases were harder, if he was throwing things out the window. It was like very cool for him when he got a little older to watch things fall. I mean, that is interesting. But it can be unsafe when his window's right over the front door. And then things, big things can become dangerous and things can break. But it was, that you have to figure out when you have to set the limits. And I think both my parents are pretty good at trying to gauge when it's unsafe.
On that, in terms of setting limits, I know that there have been times where your mum has really supported him, and you have, in terms of boundaries and language that can be used. And I remember at one time he was working, and sort of the language that was being used, sort of where he was working.
Yes, I know exactly the story you're thinking of. This was not that long ago. So, relatively, it was probably 5 or 7 years ago. And he was working at his current job. And it's a place where it's all guys, and they're lifting heavy things, and they're, getting their hands dirty, and it's, guys kind of place. And he was with at the time, I think she was a fiance or a girlfriend, and she was sitting in the living room, and my mom was there, and I was there. And he comes in and tells a very, very vulgar joke. And he loves to tell jokes, and he loves to have, he likes to repeat jokes even, loves to get the room laughing. But he really didn't, read the room that this was not an appropriate audience. He's no longer at work. And while he learned the joke at work and maybe said it at work, I'm not going to say it now, but it just was really inappropriate. And my mom just shut it down immediately. There was no, I think people have a tendency to sort of laugh off because they're uncomfortable. We all sort of do that when we feel uncomfortable. But it doesn't really help them. And she didn't get angry. She just shut it down very directly. And I think that's important to remember, to just try to calmly be direct. And you can't say that. You can't say that in front of your wife. You can't say that in front of your mother. There's women here. That's not appropriate. And that was it. And he heard it.
Did he understand that, do you think?
I do think he did because, he's older and that's been over time, there are things that are appropriate and things that are inappropriate. I mean, even when he was younger, he had I don't want to call it it's not a habit, but it's just like a sensory need for smelling hair. He loved smelling hair and he loved walking by and just, it's a way he got to know someone. And not in an intimate way, just it could be my girlfriend sitting at the kitchen table, which was not awesome. But, over time, he'd hear that's inappropriate. It was the word that our family chose to use. And
I think you're also very good at always explaining why, because I think when we have the why, that really then makes more sense and helps anyone to understand the reasons behind why something like that is inappropriate or may make somebody else feel quite uncomfortable.
I think that's an excellent point because if my mother had just said, that's inappropriate, don't do that, he wouldn't have understood why it was okay at work, but it's not okay sitting in the living room with people he's known for a long time.
So, Christi, can you kind of give us one takeaway message that we can share with families about negotiating some of the rough times in adolescence?
I guess a takeaway might be to just always make sure you're recognizing, their strengths and their interests and valuing them and appreciating them and using that as your way of connecting with them and understanding it's their way of interacting with the world during that time. And I think there's a lot that people on the spectrum can offer and a lot of interesting strengths and interests that if you just take the time and sort of join them in, it can be rewarding. And
I think your experience also shows us that individuals with special needs do grow. Mm-hmm. They may grow at a different pace or in a somewhat different direction, but just because he loved flags at 11 doesn't mean he's going to love flags his whole life.
That is very true. But it can also evolve into something a little bit different. He always loved Super Mario. And now he doesn't play Mario all the time, but he still has a love. And if you go to his Facebook page, there it is on his page. And, he might get a little, he gets excited if he sees a T-shirt or something like that. But, it's not always a passing phase. It's just something, an interest in their life, and you never know how it will evolve. It could become a skill of theirs. It could become something they can use later in life. So it's important not to squash it because we're afraid of how much they like it.
Right. Or it could be a connection to other people that they can exploit as well.
Absolutely.
So, Granny Rhea, let's see what one of our listeners has sent us for today's super special question. Our super special question for today is, what is the difference between augmentative communication, alternative communication, and facilitated communication?
That's a big question, Auntie Donia. I think a lot of people get confused about those things. Let's talk a little bit first about just what these things are. So augmentative and alternative communication, which is often called AAC, means using some tool to help a person broaden their ability to communicate. So some people can't talk because they have cerebral palsy, for example, and their muscles in their vocal apparatus just don't work so well, and their speech is hard to understand. So all they really need is some replacement for that motor behavior that results in speech. They don't need to learn how to have things to communicate, or they don't need to learn what the grammar of the language is or what the words mean. They basically know that already. They just need a way to make their expression comprehensible to other people. So there are lots of devices now, and we're actually in a kind of golden age of
AAC because we do have so much better devices than we used to. Some devices are able to convert typing to speech, so the person can type either with their hands or sometimes they type with a head stick by moving their head around an enlarged keyboard, or even using eye gaze to direct their attention to a particular letter on a keyboard that then is fed into a computer and is put together into speech output. So there are lots of tools available to help people with those kinds of problems to express themselves more effectively and efficiently. Other people, the main problem is not just a muscular barrier, but it's really more comprehensive difficulty in formulating the kinds of ideas that you want to express, in understanding what other people are saying to you. And in those cases, more fundamental kinds of tools are needed. One that's very common these days is called Picture Exchange Communication System, which essentially teaches children how to communicate by using pictures initially for them to exchange for objects that they want, and then building up that skill into a more complex array of behaviors that allow them to exchange not only for objects, but for ideas, for making comments on things that they experience, and gradually ups the ante so that they are able to convey a wider range of thoughts and observations about the world. That's obviously a bigger task than just replacing somebody's motor output. And I think we'll talk at another podcast more about that, Auntie Donia. I think that would be something we could share with parents. But let's talk about facilitated communication. Facilitated communication is not the same thing as augmentative or alternative communication. Because with AAC, the message comes from the speaker. It comes from the individuals with disabilities. The idea behind facilitated communication was, again, to address those individuals who had trouble not only motorically forming a message, but conceptually linguistically forming a message. And the idea was that you would sort of prompt them by directing their motor behavior in a way that would allow them to send messages, get reinforcement from the environment, and then eventually they would pick it up on their own. The problem with facilitated communication is that those facilitators never quite stepped back far enough to really allow the speaker to create independent communication. And what happened was they continued communicating for the individual in ways that made it look as if the individual was the author of the communication, but in fact that was not true. And there were some pretty horrific results of this. Some children appeared to communicate accusations of sexual assault against members of their family by means of facilitated communication. They were removed from their homes, their families were separated, and only when these cases came to trial did it become obvious that these messages did not originate from the child or the affected individual. They originated from the facilitator. Now, why they originated from the facilitator is a whole other question that we're not going to be able to answer here. But the fact is that a large body of research, including both court cases and more controlled experiments, very convincingly demonstrated that most facilitated communication originated with the facilitator, not with the client. And that's why most of us in the field of speech-language pathology, as well as related disciplines, have really stepped away from facilitated communication and attempted to work with more augmentative and alternative communication methods. There have been statements by many of the professional organizations explaining this, that facilitated communication is not independent communication, and recommending against using it. But there are still practitioners and families who work with them who have been using this method. So we do want people to be aware that In most cases, it is not the preferred option for people who don't speak, and that we need to be very careful about the way in which we use our augmentative communication to make sure that the real author is the person with a disability, because that's what we really want to do. We want to enable them to express themselves, not use them as a puppet to express someone else's ideas. Auntie Donia, have you had any experience or information about this?
I think just to piggyback on what you've just shared, it's really important for our listeners to understand the difference between augmentative, alternative communication and facilitated communication, because I have successfully worked with families and their children and adolescents too, to provide them with a tool to be able to communicate. And often there is a great concern amongst many of the families I work with when we say we need to introduce an AAC system, and it just really helping families to understand that it can be successful when done the right way. And I think to just go back to what you had said about the facilitated communication, if we had seen that they had kind of been giving full prompts and then they had been kind of going back and not actually then prompting completely, then we could have said perhaps there was more individuality and success, but it wasn't. It was fully prompted. And that's the same as me taking somebody's hands and prompting them physically to sign for open when I don't really know if they want me to open something for them or not.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and one that we do want to remember. So just to kind of make this as brief as possible, our recommendation to families that we work with, and hopefully to our listeners as well, is that facilitated communication is not a direction we want to go in for most of our clients, but augmentative and alternative communication can be very helpful and very freeing for people that have difficulty expressing themselves independently. Auntie Donia, there are so many myths and misconceptions in working with children with developmental disabilities. And some of them are so absurd, they just make us go, arghhh! Well, since we have a super special guest today, let's ask her. Christi, what makes you go, arghhh?
So sometimes on the topic of AAC, something that can be very frustrating is, as a therapist, coming into families where they've been using AAC successfully or with great intent. So there was a need, and it was great that it was implemented, but it hasn't evolved. And I think sometimes it's the child's evolving, they're developing, and they need something new. Maybe, the picture board, communication board they're using isn't what they need anymore. They need something more complex, maybe something, a computer of some sort to facilitate their more complex thoughts and emotions. Or perhaps they've had so many therapists that have evolved, come in and out, that they just never get past like phase 1 of PECS, and the picture exchange communication system. And they continue to restart it, and then ultimately what happens is the student, the client, is very frustrated because they have a lot more to communicate, and they can't because the system hasn't kept up with their abilities. And of course, there can be a lot of different variables in that, but that is what I find frustrating.
That is frustrating, Christi. I know exactly what you mean. I see lots of students with autism and other kinds of disabilities who learn how to say 5 or 10 words using PECS. I don't mean say words, but express 5 or 10 different concepts using PECS, and then it never goes any farther. what we forget when we let this happen is that typically developing children need a lot of support to move from single words to multi-word utterances to full sentences. And children with special needs need the same kind of support and even more than the typically developing child does. And it's not enough to be able to produce 10 words. That's not going to get you very much bang for your output. You need to be able to not only say the 10 things that you like best, but to say, I don't want that, I want this. Or to say, I'm tired of that, give me something else. We need to have some training that moves the child away from just saying one thing at a time to being able to incorporate a couple of elements within their expression. Auntie Donia, I know you've done a lot of work with AAC with many students. What's your experience?
I have, and sometimes it's been very successful, and there are other times when it hasn't been successful. And I think when I really look and see why hasn't it been successful, a couple of things come up. So one is that we don't stay with a system long enough. So, for example, if we've introduced an iPad as a communicative device, it's been used perhaps for a couple of weeks, but it's the therapist coming in and working with the student. But the only way it can be successful is that if it's used across multiple environments, if it's used functionally. And I know that for one of the children I worked with, was a little boy with cerebral palsy, when he realized the power he had in hearing this voice output device, and when we made sure it sounded like a little boy and it didn't sound like, an older man, or sometimes therapists won't even change the gender. I mean, not all the time, but, considerations that need to be made too. It was so powerful for him, and he pressed the button, and it was for his grandmother, and he said, "Come, Nana." And she ran towards him and gave him a huge hug and a kiss, and he laughed and he smiled. And because it was used functionally, we were then able to use that in other settings too. So he would ask other people to come. He would ask to receive things because he understood that that was his voice.
Yeah, that's a wonderful story and very inspiring. And I think that as therapists, we want to try to make sure that we move forward with each session, even if it's only a little bit, so that we're not just practicing what the child already knows, but we're upping the ante and pushing his envelope so he gets a little bit farther in terms of communication. The other thing I want to mention is that there's been quite a lot of research on this now, and what this research tells us is that voice output devices, where you press a button and the machine talks for you, or you type a word and the machine puts those letters together into a spoken word, those particular kinds of AAC are especially effective in eliciting speech from children who haven't talked before. So even though it seems like maybe this is a very complex system to give a child who's not talking at all, if we can work up to it in a way that the child learns how to, as Auntie Donia said, functionally use the device, that voice output seems to be powerful. And I think Auntie Donia's point about matching the voice to the child is also very important. So we want to make sure boys sound like boys and girls sound like girls and men sound like men and so on. But if we can keep those constraints in mind, I think we can really provide a wonderful outlet for communication.
Granny Rhea, there is nothing wrong with eating cake for breakfast.
You are so right, Auntie Donia, and we're going to be talking about some things that are as much fun as eating cake for breakfast.
Granny Rhea, what cake are we eating for breakfast today?
Well, Auntie Donia, since we have our super special friend Christi here, I'd like to hear about what things she enjoyed doing with her brother when he was growing up.
Well, I'd love to share that. I have great memories of playing video games, believe it or not, with my brother. And I know video games get mixed reviews from many audience members, including myself with my own son. But it actually was a real engagement opportunity with him. And when he was, sometimes we would sit and just be next to each other playing Super Mario Brothers. And that would be the time when he would start talking. So we were engaged in something that he liked, and he chose. And believe me, it wasn't always my first choice activity, but when I was playing the games with him, he would start talking about things that are happening at school or things that happened during the day. So it was an opportunity for him to share that he normally wouldn't care about sharing with me.
And some games children play alone, of course. But
Right.
then nowadays, many of the games are what they call multiplayer games, which means you're actually playing with somebody in a remote location. Is that right?
Yes, that is. So a lot of times we think about video games as something that you do in isolation, and sometimes that makes us uncomfortable, a little bit nervous, because you envision your child sitting alone and not interacting at all. But many of the games, whether it's Minecraft or Roblox or Fortnite, they have the ability to play with other kids. Sometimes schools even teach the kids how to do this, but they're not playing alone, and there's different ways that you can play with friends outside of your living room. So it can actually be a social experience. But I will say that even before this today, we have all these opportunities for the kids to play the games socially. But even back when my brother was a kid, and it was, Mario Brothers, the kids would come over from the neighborhood, and it was not only something people were excited to play with him, and he made some of his friends that way, lifelong friends. He just went to one of his friends' weddings, but they became friends over Mario Brothers. So it's not always a terrible thing. Of course, finding the right limits and the right balance for your family and for your child is important. And I struggle with that daily with my own son. But I happen to be a believer that saying no to it, especially when it's something so motivating and an interest area for them, when you can get engagement, when you join them in playing or you allow friends to come over and play, it can be a wonderful tool for socializing, in fact.
I think you're really right. And it reminds me of my experience with my son when he was a young boy, that the video games just came out around the time he was turning 5. And even at 5, he became horribly addicted to these games, and he would play them for hours on end, and it was such a struggle to get him to give them up and to move away from them. And I was convinced that these games were going to ruin him for life, that he was never going to be a fully functioning human being, because all he wanted to do was sit in front of this TV screen with this little controller hitting buttons for hours on end. It was terrifying. But, one of the nice things about being a granny is that you get to see the kind of long view. And I can tell you right now that my son is all grown up. He went to college. He's a lawyer. He has a wife and a beautiful granddaughter, and he is a fabulous father. Not to brag, but the point is that despite my inability to control his gaming very much and to dissuade him from these addictions, he turned okay. He turned out okay anyway. So I think maybe we're all a little more scared than we need to be about the effects of some of these activities. And for our kids with special needs, as Christi was telling us, they can really provide opportunities that might not be available otherwise.
So now it's time for our favourite part, which is to eat some cake together. And today's cake is all the way from Manhattan, from Eli Zabar.
Oh, wow. I bet you're glad you came today, Christi. You picked a good day to join us. Let's see what we can get out of this carrot cake. It looks very thick and rich, and it's got a cream cheese icing, which is my favorite, and it's topped with some chopped nuts. I hope we have 3 forks, because I'm sure we're all going to want to try this cake. Here you go.
It's delicious.
The Let's Talk About Super Special Kids and Cake podcast would like to thank our host, Sacred Heart University's School of Communication and Media Studies. We'd also like to thank our composer, Marty Eisenberg, our editor, Brent, and our audio engineer and director of cake-based operations, Matt Henshaw.